Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be sitting down today with Nina Kraus, who is a neuroscientist particularly interested in sound. And she's published what I think is a marvelous and extremely interesting book called Of Sound Mind. And it's a wonderful thing because so many books that are full of important scientific facts are very dull and dry. And I found this book um, very interesting. It was enjoyable to read, a pleasure to read, and there were lots of little insights along the way. So thank you very much, Nina, for agreeing to be here.
Well, thank you, Ian. It's wonderful, and your books have really made a big impression on me over the past few years, and I thank you for writing them.
Well, no, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to have discovered, since we corresponded, that you have so many interests in common with me and so many feelings about the brain, the mind, consciousness, and how it works, which we can share, which is lovely. I know that you're Italian by origin, and you sometimes in the book refer to la mamma, your particular mother, I suppose. And at what age did you move to America?
Well, I actually grew up in a household where these multiple languages were spoken, and that household was both in Trieste and in New York at the same time. So
Okay,
from when I was born until I went off to college,
I
I would
see.
spend about 3 months of every 4 months of every year in Italy, and I did most of my
Right,
education in the
right,
States, but I would just go back and
right.
forth a couple of times a
Yes,
year to Italy, and
yes.
I think that very much shaped my feeling about where I belong. I don't feel deeply Italian,
Right.
and I don't feel deeply American, but I feel that
Right.
I belong at the intersection. I feel very comfortable
Mm, mm,
in these worlds, and I think that scientifically, where I feel more comfortable is at the intersection of boundaries and intersection of
mm,
fields. And I know, you
mm,
are
mm.
uncommonly good at finding commonalities among seemingly disparate areas, and that's something that I do reasonably well. It's something that we
Absolutely.
really think about at Brain Volts, and it's both the agony and the ecstasy because
Yes,
we
yes.
cross these disciplines, and I think that's what makes our work unique and very strong. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I really like about your book is that you show how broadly sound ramifies into all that we are.
Yes.
It's not. We tend to think of sound as a rather sort of compartmentalized aspect of life, but it's of course all our experience is shot through with sound. And I wondered, was there something about the differences between the soundscape I can imagine in Trieste and the soundscape in probably urban America that got you interested in this whole question of sound?
Well, I don't know if it was in particular the soundscape, although I can tell you just a recent experience of a month ago that relates to that directly. But as I said, I did live in this household with multiple languages, and my mother was a pianist. And so I spent a lot
Mm,
of time playing under the piano. That was my favorite place to bring my little things because it sounded so good. It felt so good to be there while I was working. And so when I went to college, first I majored in comparative literature because I knew some languages and I like to read. And then I took biology, and I ran into Lenberg's book, the Biological Foundations of Language, and I thought, ooh, we can
right.
combine these things. And so then I,
Yes,
I,
yes.
I went to graduate school in neuroscience, and
Right.
also first began studying something very, very specific. It was two-tone suppression in the auditory nerve of the chinchilla. And
Right.
and this is where La Mama comes in. I'm explaining to La Mama how I spend my time. And, I realized at that point that there were maybe 16 people in the world that I could have a nuanced conversation with on two-tone suppression of the auditory nerve, which I loved. But I also realized that if I could not explain to my mom how I was spending my time, I didn't want to be doing that thing. And so, my work has I've always thought about how can we use what we know, and how can we how can the world inform the science? Again, it's this reciprocity, so that we can maybe understand our world a little bit better.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Your attempts to explain things to your mama have stood you in very good stead, because I think it's one of the noticeable features is that you are talking, as it were, to the reader. I hope to do that too, not to assume knowledge, but to explain things to people without being patronizing, so that they are carried along by it. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And it's interesting, isn't it, that you started off in comparative literature and then moved to neuroscience, because there's a kind of parallel there with me. And interestingly, yesterday I was talking to the English novelist Sally Vickers, and she started off reading literature at Cambridge and then became a Jungian analyst. But I mean, she's very interested in the brain as well. So I think being able to, hold these different areas together has merit, even though nowadays it's not much encouraged.
no, it's not. I hope we can talk a little bit about science. But first, I think. Well, first, let me just jump back and finish this one little thing about being in Trieste with my grandson a few weeks ago, and being in the woods with him, and realizing that, well, first of all, my grandson is the most open-minded person I know. And he, whenever we'd go into the woods, he would relax. In fact, I wondered if he was asleep. And no, his eyes were wide and he was looking around. He was clearly listening. And this is a child who lives in New York City.
Yeah,
So very different, right? Anyway, our
yeah, yeah, yeah.
soundscapes I think, are very important. And
Lovely.
I think
Yes,
that it gets to the thesis of my book, which is that the hearing brain is vast. The hearing brain
yes,
is
yes,
vast, and it encompasses what we know, how we think, how we feel,
yeah,
how we move, our interaction with our other
yeah,
senses. The formal way of saying it is that it engages our cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward systems. And that's
yes,
very different from the
yes, yes,
conventional view of hearing. First of all, it's often very centered on the ear, and we have this brain that talks to the ear and back and forth. And it's not only, if you then look at auditory neuroscience, you see the auditory pathway, and the classical pathway is auditory nerve to cortex and back. And of course, it's so much vaster. I mean, what we feel, our
exactly.
guts
Yes,
influence
yes,
how we
yes,
hear. And so
exactly.
it's vast. It's a very holistic perspective, and and the sound mind really evolves from our experience with sound throughout our lives. And I try to make the point that it really shapes who we are and how we connect to the world around us.
Yes, yes.
And just to give you a sketch of it, the first part one is how sound works. And so there I talk about
Yes,
signals outside the head and signals inside the head. And you taught me this wonderful word, interpenetration, which, and the intersection, the interpenetration of signals outside the head, so sound, and signals inside the head, electricity, is something that has held my fascination for as long as I can remember. So I talk about that, and then learning how we merge and intersect with the signals outside with the signals inside the head. And then finally, I talk about how we have figured out how to measure sound processing in the brain with exquisite precision. You know, I'm a biologist, and it's again, we'll talk about paradoxes, I'm sure, but you know, on the one hand, I'm very interested in the minutia of signals and precision, and on the other hand, I think I take a very spiritual view of hearing. But anyway, we can measure, you know, of course, as anyone who's might be listening to us, the nerves in our brain respond to sound, and we can pick up that electricity with scalp electrodes. In our animal models, we go in with the microelectrodes. And what we've really learned, because now then the second part of the book, and that's really the main part of the book, it's 2/3 of the book, is our sonic selves. And that really is about how it really matters what we do, because our life in sound makes us who we are, and makes us respond to the world in our own unique way. So if you make music, if you speak another language, if you have a language impairment, as we age, as we develop from infancy, noise is a great big part of our lives. Physical activity, and I talk about athletes and head injury, you know, because making sense of sound is one of the hardest jobs we ask our brain to do. If you get hit in the head, that's going to disrupt this very, very, very beautiful, beautiful, fine way of making sense of the world. And so, you know, the crux of the book is really about how we can make generalizations about, say, what the musician's neural signature is. You know, if you make music, your brain will automatically enhance certain aspects of sound, the harmonics, certain aspects of timing. Yet, the other part of it, you know, we have the groups, and then we have the individual, because I can take the brains of two people who I might call musicians, and I'm not talking about professional musicians, just someone who regularly makes music in their lives. And in the same way as, you know, you and I both have noses in common, but your nose is different from mine. If I play A Hard Day's Night to you, and then I can actually play back the brain's response to sound, because we're able to capture it with such precision. We have this electrical signal that then we can sonify. So I can listen to how you hear A Hard Day's Night, and you can listen to how I hear A Hard Day's Night, and it's recognizable both as A Hard Day's Night, but there's a difference. So, you know, we can get at a bit of the holy grail of individual differences.
That's lovely, because it draws together both the idea of the constant uniqueness of an experience and the idea that it is an encounter, that has something of us in it and something of whatever else is there. And you talk about how important the efferent pathways from the brain, those that go to the ear, are, whereas probably most people think the afferent pathways, those that conduct information from the ear to the brain, are all that it's about. But you have this very nice picture of a hypothesis you call the beams hypothesis, in which you see that the brain prepares the ear for certain sounds. So it comes back to this idea that I think is very important, that our perceptions are never just passive or blank. They all are reaching out towards something that is anticipated, and that we shape what we see by our experience. You bring out the importance of memory, and memory is really our past experience, and that helps to shape what we then go on to hear. Perhaps you could talk a bit about that.
Oh, I'd love to. So the M in beams, BEAMS, is memory. And
Yeah.
in fact, memory is what makes us us. So how does this happen biologically? B stands for brain. Then E is this efferent pathway, or efferent pathway, and it involves all of the information about our cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward systems and how they relate to hearing. It involves all of the pathways that connect the brain to the ear. And there are so many connections. And when we experience sound, it is our efferent system that is very much involved in learning. So if we engage in a certain activity over and over and over and over again, it is our efferent system at work, which eventually, in time, turns into signals that are the afferent, so BEA. The afferent is the ear to brain pathway. That's the default, the automatic pathway, the pathway that says, oh, that's the sound of my son's voice. I know that really well. So automatically, that is processed really, really well. It is your afferent pathway that reflects your life and sound, your memory, and why, when you're asleep and not especially responsive to most sounds, if I say, Ian, your brain is probably going to, it's that afferent system is just going to respond because that is, you've learned that that's an important signal in your life. And so that then becomes our memory for sound, which is making us, is shaped through the years of our using our efferent pathway and how it intersects with the afferent pathway and our intersection with the world. And it's constantly changing as our memories do. And that's just a way that I've tried to formalize the work with a nice picture that was drawn by
I love it. I think it's very
illustrated.
Helpful.
There are 80 pictures in my book, and science is an art, and I'm really lucky to be able to work with an artist who can kind of read my mind. But anyway, that's Beans in a nutshell.
I so much agree that science is an art. And just on the afferent pathways, when I was in medical school, it was a bit of an embarrassment that there were of course, efferent pathways from the brain to the heart that told the heart what to do. But it was a bit of an embarrassment that there were all these fibers that were going back from the heart to the brain, giving lots of information. What was that about? And then the gut, the human gut has more neurons in it than the brain of a dog. What are they for? And these are afferent pathways. So what you have brought out here is a number of things which, if I may just for a moment refer to hemispheres, suggest two quite different visions of what we're doing when we're doing science, to come back to your idea that it is an art. Because as far as the left hemisphere is concerned, there are fairly simple circuits, and they are schematic, and they're specifiable. We hope they're measurable. We can put figures to what's going on. And you mention in the book that your colleagues all want to know where the sort of generating zone is. And this is a problem because, of course, it's due to the left hemisphere wanting to localize things and suggest that it's in things rather than between things. And the right hemisphere, on the other hand, is seeing that all these things are embodied, that the big context is the body, not just what we think of as the brain as a sort of mechanism. It's the whole of our body with all its stored experience, its memories, its feelings that are taking part in making us what we are, making the world what it is. And your book brings this to life in a wonderful way. It's what I call betweenness, that things don't exist in here or in there, but in something that may actually be a very complex web in which things are interconnected.
Well, that's in fact, the thesis that I wanted to talk with you about today, and that has just been really on my mind, which is the fact that, okay, you look at the world through the context of the hemispheres. I use sound and vibration, but to me, sound and vibration is the best embodiment of your betweenness that I know of. And
I think you're
betweenness, it really happens in sound and in vibration, not only in humans, even in
exactly,
plants. Okay, as you point out, the body,
exactly,
other organisms, plants, the world. So
exactly.
this is big. This is big, conscious,
Yes, it is
unconscious.
big.
But you and I were having this conversation now. There's nothing like it. I mean, we are everyday improvisers.
I know.
I've
Yes.
been, we've been studying and thinking about the things we think about, and now here we are, and there's this back and forth. We don't have a script, and
No,
it's so
no.
powerful, and yet,
It's a
it's
lovely
under
thing for
recognized.
me. Yes, and it is perhaps an instance of what you're talking about, the reverberative relationship, in which each contributes to the other. And as you quite rightly say, it's a very important thing in plants that respond to vibrations in the soil, vibrations in the air, and so forth. And that's what's lovely about sound, because, of course, every sensory organ uses vibrations, touch, and so on. But sight and sound have different qualities, don't they? Very, very much. We see sight as being us detached from something around us
You
and
say
inspecting it.
represented, right?
Represented, exactly. We can train ourselves to be present and for the thing to presence to us. But a lot of the time we think of the visual world, and I think it does actually seem to be something that's around us rather separate from us, even though, of course, sight is also reverberative. But there was something you said in the book, which I had been thinking about, and you nailed it, which is that all organisms have cilia. And this is really a remarkable fact, because cilia, of course, are the little sort of fibers or whatever that one wants to call them, like little hairs, really, that respond to the environment. And it was pointed out by, I think his name is Buzatsky, he's a Hungarian electrophysiologist, that there are sea creatures that, as far as we know, have no organs of perception apart from these little frond-like cilia that are, and that enables them to get food and to do everything. So these reverberative, responsive elements that are part, as you so rightly say, of every living creature are these elements that respond to the environment. And of course, even a cell, as I'm always saying to people, a cell looks in a photograph or in a diagram in a textbook like something bounded by a wall, but that wall is constantly a kind of semi-permeable membrane in which things are coming and going all the time. It hardly really exists. It's a flow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I really, I think that the cilia encapsulate the commonality of that all living organisms have. Our trees. I mean, as if any plumber can tell you, tree roots will find their way into the water pipes underneath the ground,
Yes, yes.
and it's been shown that it's the hearing that there is some vibratory aspect that is being picked up by these roots, at about the frequency of 70, 80 hertz. And it
Exactly.
draws the plants towards water. So plants, animals without brains, we all have these vibratory ciliary forces that guide us and that create, I think, so beautifully this betweenness that you talk about,
Yes.
because That's how it works in my little
Yes.
mind.
No, and in pointing out that it's not just any old vibration, but a very particular frequency. You're pointing to something that's quite intelligent, that flowers begin, I think you mentioned this, to to respond to the sort of frequency that a bee will have, not to a non-furry insect that would be no good for carrying away the pollen. Now that is a lovely vignette, I think.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
you would know Monica Galliano's work because you quote
yes,
her, I know,
yeah, and David
with
Haskell
pea
has
shoots and so on.
David
Yes,
Haskell has done
yes,
some beautiful work. And I think I learned about the bees and the fact that they respond, or the flowers will open, and give
yes,
their fruit to only,
yes,
not only to, not to other vibrations, but not even to other bees, only to the bees, the buzz at the particular frequency that they have learned,
yes,
because
yes.
they have learned will be most likely to carry their fruit around to become more flowers again.
Yes, yes, it's wonderful. And what's extraordinary is that people may think, well, plants just have some. I mean, people have a very primitive idea of what DNA is. They think in that now extremely dated vision of Richard Dawkins that somehow genes are, contain all the script for life, and that we are just the lumbering robots that carry them around. But as we've discovered, the genome contains very little information compared with what we need, and it's more like a storehouse on which the cell can draw when it needs. And that's the extraordinary thing, is people might think that plants react, of course they do, but they're somehow programmed to react. But what research now shows is that plants can respond to situations that they could never have been prepared for, either in their individual experience or in the experience of their genus. So that this is intelligent responsiveness. Better to do this than to do that, which is extraordinary. Most people wouldn't think that was possible in a plant.
Yeah, and I think I read it in The Matter with Things. You talk about experiments with this is not plants, but with mice that have been taught that a particular smell will result in
Yes,
something they're not very happy about. And so they suffer through that. And interestingly, this information is carried on
yes,
in multiple generations that have never
yes,
experienced the
yes,
the negative
yes,
consequences of that smell. And you
yes,
know, biology
yes.
is so beautiful. It's so
It
beautiful.
is.
It's so rich. It's
And
so deep. And what I
it
feel
is wonderful.
so comfortable with, and which I love so much from your book, is embracing the limitations of science, embracing, because it is so deep, and our methods really cannot fully understand them, and I don't believe that this is a belief. I don't believe that it is knowable, but we have this limitation in science, but especially I love embracing paradox.
Yes,
And
yes,
you talk about
yes,
this, and
yes.
it was so good. Your books have really calmed me, because I have felt this all my life. I've always felt this thing is true, and its opposite is also true. And as a scientist, I
Yes,
have often been pressured to, explain yourself. That can't be.
yes, yes,
If you follow a rational argument, you're going to, you got to choose. Is it this or is it that? And the fact
yeah,
is, and my poor students, they always want answers, and I always say it depends.
yes,
Context
yes,
matters. Context is everything. And there are
Yes.
no firm answers, and it is very, very common
Yeah.
for anything that is complicated is going to have two facets
Yes.
to it, as you think about.
Yes. Yes, I want to, just for the sake of people who don't know my work, just clear up a couple of possible misconceptions. One is they might say, well, look, hang on, when mice are taught to fear the smell of cherry blossom and it's passed on to the next generation. That's genes, isn't it? Well, it isn't actually. It's far too little time for there to be genetic changes. What happens is there are what are called epigenetic changes, as you know, and that these are to do with the way in which genes get expressed, and the genome sort of organizes itself in order to express certain things. It's not a matter of selecting genes that will code for something. It's some kind of configuration or a gestalt that causes a configuration of the genome in such a way that it expresses itself in whatever this activity or behavior is. And the other thing I just want to say is, because while it's true that I do say there are limits to science, it seems to me self transparent that there are limits to science, as there are limits to every way in which we can try and get a handle on the world. But I see myself as a great champion of science, and sometimes it falls to somebody who really believes in science to be the one to say, but certain rather absurd, extravagant claims made on behalf of science don't actually honor science. They, in a way, lead us to disrespect science. So I'm a guardian of that. One of the things that worries me at the moment is that there are people around, and you probably can't help being aware of this, who are propagandizing against science, who are saying that science can't be wrong if it tells us things we don't like. And this seems to me terrifying. I mean, we have gone so far with the painstaking work which tells us the things that we can, to an extent, rely on. I mean, I never think there is one truth, but there are things that we think are truer than others. Otherwise, we wouldn't either be able to say or do anything. So what do we use? And one of the things we use is science. So I think it's an enormously invaluable resource, and I draw on it all the time. It's just that it can't actually deal with everything. It can't measure love, for example. And it's no good saying, well, it's release of oxytocin or something. You're describing something that is going on somewhere that has nothing to do with what love is. It doesn't help answer it. And so much of our experience, all the things we really value, like the nature of music and so on, are things that can't really, and you make this point, they can't be easily measured. How do you research on music when nobody will agree what music is, where is it being processed, what are the criteria for accepting that there is a response or there isn't? So you've really gone into an area where you were beset with difficulties, and you've been that honourable scientist who has done good science, which I thoroughly believe in, but has also seen, like I believe all good imaginative scientists, that there are things that are always going to be beyond science to determine, because we have other ways of determining them, using our reason, using our intuition, and above all, using our imagination, which doesn't take us away from reality, but actually is the only possibility we have for getting into reality.
Yeah, yeah. I've got to say so I wrote down one quote of yours that I think is very relevant here. You say, informed opinion and judgment are all each of us have to go on when dealing with any of the big questions about life. And as far as this unquote, as far as the informed opinions, a lot. I love science, and I get many of my informed opinions by by looking at the science,
Exactly.
and I have chosen signals inside and outside the head as a way of looking at something really great and big and deep, which is, why is it that we respond so deeply to music and the sounds of the people we love. But we can get to some a little bit. We can understand a little bit more of it. I think we've learned some important things that then we can put together and try to put together a view of how things work. You mentioned love and music. One of the areas that we study is aging. And if you go to a conference on aging, everything that you can measure gets worse as you get older. So you can kind of come out of that conference and everybody's saying, "Oh yeah, it's really terrible to get older," but how do you measure wisdom? I think that there is such
You're right.
beauty in realizing that. That doesn't mean the science is wrong. I mean, it's true. I mean, just in my own personal life, I know it takes me longer to find the right key to get into my back door than it used to. I used to do it with, 2 bags of groceries and a child in my arm very quickly without waking the baby. It takes me longer now. But I
Yeah,
feel, and I really do think that my sense and perception of the world is very different from what it was, and I feel that it has been
absolutely.
enriched greatly
Absolutely.
by living.
Yeah.
So
Uh,
these things are hard to measure.
Undoubtedly. They are hard to measure, but because they are hard to measure, they tend to be neglected. Everything that can't be measured gets outside of the question. Um, to the extent that I quote in the book a report by WHO on dealing with onchocerciasis in Africa, a cause of blindness in children and in adults, that comes from a river parasite. And it concludes its report by saying it's impossible to say whether there are benefits to this program, although many people were able to keep their sight, because they weren't in employment. So we can't measure whether they've actually, as it were, gone down or up the economic scale. This is really extraordinary, and all the time I hear, plans about developing some ghastly tourist attraction in the middle of a place of great wildness and beauty being discussed only in terms of what it will do to the economy, not what it will do to increasingly rare places where we feel at home in nature. And
But you
so
can measure.
I'm
You can measure
absolutely,
the dollars.
you can measure them, yeah.
And
So I had a sort of a little moment of insight, I think, when you were talking about that business. I'd never really thought about it, but when you're young, you are actually picking up, you're relatively early in the business of picking up information that will help you build a picture of the world. So actually you need very precise faculties and precise sensory organs to be able to give you precise data. And that is really the sort of left hemisphere thing, which can be developed quite highly in young people. So they've got a theory about how life works. They've got a schema of how life works. It's like I look at the map, I understand the territory, but they're not been to the territory yet. And as they grow older, they find the territory is far more rich and complicated than the theory they had when they were young. And that is the right hemisphere, being able to contact experience and try and put together a vision of who we are, what we're doing here, and what the world is. So that is the wisdom you're talking about, that as we get older, we don't get stupider, in my view. Some of us may, I don't know. Maybe I'm so stupid I don't even notice it. But I think when one thinks about the value of experience, it's not something that can be measured and is therefore taken out of all the accounts of what a human being is.
yeah, but Ian, I think you are also disturbed and rather terrified by where our world is moving because of so much of what we do is guided by what can be measured. I can I can just think of two everyday examples. One are beeping trucks,
Yes.
which are very useful, especially in a construction zone. But every vehicle should not. There's no reason to have that. It is because sound is our alarm sense. Every time something like that happens, people complain, oh, I can't focus. Well, of course you can't focus because you're being alarmed every minute, either by some device of yours or by some truck outside. But the fact is, you can measure deaths that might occur when vehicles back up, but you cannot measure the effect that has on the sound mind, on the human psyche. And similarly, I just came back from Italy, where I rented a car, and they are becoming more and more automatized.
Oh,
So
aren't they just?
there's this great big lavender bush that sticks out into my driveway, and when the car goes up the driveway, it comes to a complete stop because there's something in the way. Terribly dangerous. And I think, though, let's think about this and what happens in terms of the development of the brain. In what we can measure, perhaps, if we had self-driving cars, and just the way cars are today, maybe there are fewer accidents that can be measured. But what has that done to our brain? We're no longer looking when we are driving. We have no sense of where are we in space. My colleague he collided with a bike rider. He was in his car, collided with a bike rider who suddenly veered into traffic into my colleague's car. And fortunately, everyone was okay, although my colleague is still shaken up by it. And one of the things that this young man said when he was talking to my friend was, that's funny. You didn't come up in my electronic device that is monitoring my surroundings. So, and imagine riding a bike and not looking. Depending on something to tell you that there's this enormous thing that can kill you in an instant, immediately to your left. So,
and people looking at their screens when they're walking around in the urban setting, or even in even more heinous in the wild. I've got a photograph somewhere of a boat full of people on Milford Sound, in South Island of New Zealand, one of the most sublime landscapes in the world, and they're all looking at their tablets like this. But anyway, there's so much there. I mean, first of all, I don't think that automatic cars so far have a very good safety record, but maybe they'll improve. But at the moment, we're so risk averse. I mean, life is a risky business. If you don't accept some risks, you won't live. And indeed, there is one risk that none of us avoid, which is the big risk that we're going to die. So it's based on the premise that if we can only lead these terribly frightened lives all the time with alarms going off and warnings and so on, that we'll be happier and more fulfilled. But in fact, we're not. We're more frightened. We're more afraid, fearful, depressed, gloomy, stressed than we were. We know that for a fact. So it's not working, this whole way of thinking about things. And one of the things that I feel is that we are being de-skilled. I feel it myself. I used to, before I had a GPS system in the car, I used to look at a map and I could see and feel where it was I was going. I now tend to put in a postcode into the GPS and let it do the trick. I was in California recently, and I allowed the GPS stupidly to guide me to where I thought I wanted to go. And it turned out I thought, this can't be right, but I don't know this area as well as no doubt this machine does. And of course, it was taking me off to Southern California when what I wanted to do was cross the bay to Marin. So, these, we shouldn't ever rely on them in this way. And I think it diminishes our capacity to take in the surroundings. Domestic animals have smaller brains than their wild counterparts because they're basically dumber, because they don't need to attend to anything. Everything's done for them and to them. That's
Yeah.
what we're becoming.
Yeah.
I mean, we've already got smaller brains than
And,
our ancestors. But
and I guess, probably the biggest, one of the big theses and messages of my book and my way of thinking is that sound connects us. Think about betweenness, but just
yes.
sound connects us in, you talk about the fact that as a society, we are becoming more depressed and more stressed and alarmed. And we are disconnected. We are very divisive. We're divided in our world and in our points of view, and sound can connect us. We see that very reverberatively if you've ever sung harmony with somebody. It's just this
Absolutely, yes.
back and forth, and you're gonna have to
Yeah.
tell me about.
Ah,
Did you ever sing in a chorus? Because your love
yeah.
uh, Thomas Tallis, you keep
Yes.
bringing that out. But this
I,
idea
I,
of
I,
the
su-
reverberating, the back and forth. I mean
yes, it's
that's something
completely
that
wonderful.
sound does.
Yes, I've sung in a choir virtually all my life from my early teens until recently because I lived so
Right.
out in the wilds that there's nobody here to choir with. But I wanted to say that also sound and another thing which is a kind of sound, which is the sound of silence, connects. So one of the wonderful things here is that there is no extraneous sound. It's very difficult to find places in the modern world where you can't hear a road, you can't hear maybe once a week a plane may go over, but basically what you are hearing is the wind in the trees, the river that passes the house, the sound of the sea, and a few sheep and the birds. And that is incredibly healing. And you are there when you listen, when you just stop and listen, you are connected. So there's a kind of suppression of good sound by bad sound, noise, interference that goes on in too many people's lives, where they're constantly working with a background of something going on. You mentioned that some of your students prefer to be somewhere where there's noise going on, or a radio on, or television on, or whatever, which is, of course, remarkable, but I'm afraid I think it's a fact that we've all seen. And it does disrupt concentration, deep attention to something.
Deep, absolutely. And so, I do think that sound is this incredibly powerful force in our lives.
Yes.
And what has surprised me about my book is the response is probably the number one response that I have gotten from people is, I had no idea. I had no idea sound was so important. And we live in a very visually biased world, a represented world.
Absolutely.
Sound is invisible.
Absolutely. No, no.
Sound has these ingredients that, in fact, we
Yes.
can measure and use to understand the sound processing in individuals. But I think that there is sound for better and for worse. So,
Yeah.
in the same way as
Yeah.
sound can connect us by singing
Yeah.
harmony,
Yes.
what
Yes.
I call noise, which is unwanted sound, and again,
Yes.
there are signals, there are noise outside the head, and then there is
Yes.
neural noise, which is a whole other topic,
Yes.
and it's a very
Yes.
important one. But the
Yes.
fact is that um, as a society, I hope that people will recognize there are things that can be done. You know, we can ask ourselves when we hear a sound that disrupts our thinking and that disrupts our focus, we can ask, is that necessary? You know, I
Right.
like to think, you know, for example, in an airport, airports are noisy places. You know, conveyor belts make
Yeah.
noise, jet engines make noise.
Yes.
Okay, you accept
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
That's necessary.
Yeah.
But do
Yeah.
we have to listen every time a boarding pass is scanned? We hear beep,
Yes. Yes.
beep. You know, I
Yes.
mean,
Yes.
the poor
Yes.
people who
Yes.
have to do, you know, stand there all day.
I know.
You know, do
I
we have
know.
to be listening to CNN? Do we have to be listening music? I love music. Do I
Yeah.
have to be forced?
Yes.
You know, is my brain in such a situation that I have to filter out the music? Do I have to be, you know, do I have to hear every time the lady next to me gets a voice message? Yeah,
Yes.
I mean,
Oh,
you can turn these things off.
things
You know,
off.
she's on her
Yes.
phone all the
Yes.
time anyway. Just turn the thing off.
Yes.
So there are
Yes.
things
Yes.
that if we were
Yes.
aware, I think we could
Yeah.
make, you know, just work to make the world a little better place. You know, my neighbor doesn't need to know when I've come home at night and I've locked my car door.
I
You know
know.
how
Yeah. Yeah.
they beep. I mean, you
Yeah.
just turn the
They
thing off.
do.
But
Yes. That's it.
I think the fact is, and it gets back to the reaction to my book, is that people really are not that aware. And I think one of
Yes.
the things your book has done is really made people think and made people aware of our personal responsibility
Yeah.
in
Well, I
trying
hope
to
so.
interact with
Yes.
the world.
You mentioned something in your book that I didn't know at all, and I found completely fascinating, which is that perpetual loud noise actually impairs our sense of taste. So people on flights where there's a lot of background noise can't taste certain flavors as well as they could in the quiet. And so they tend to reach for certain things, particularly tomatoes, for some particular reason that you know. And so I just thought that's such a wonderful example of how, you know, it's so wrong to think of these things as isolated circuits somewhere. And this comes back to the problem we haven't mentioned, the binding
Finding
problem. You
problem,
know, binding problem.
which is
And
not
just
a
for those who are not
problem.
familiar, it's not a problem. This is, for those who are not familiar with this, this is an idea that's been much discussed. How is it that an auditory system that has a little module that does this and an olfactory system has a little module that does that, how do they go to get put together to make our life? Well, the answer is they're not really ever separate. They're all part of the thing that is our conscious life and our unconscious life. It's mostly our unconscious life. It's what makes us what we are. And these systems are constantly modifying one another, communicating with one another. And there is no problem because we don't start with the bits and make the whole, left hemisphere fashion. We start with the whole, and science identifies bits and then thinks, oh, what have I done? How do these fragments fit together? I've just spoilt the jigsaw. But, you know, yeah, I want to go back, if I may, to the very, very good and important point about the connecting that happens with sound. And I wondered if you'd ever come across, it's not a very well-known book, a book called Touching the Rock by, I think he's called David Hull. It's quite simple. It's an account by a lecturer at a British university who developed a blindness in his middle years, a progressive blindness. And he charts and describes the progression away from the world of sight into the world of sound. And it is wonderful. And I suppose one or two vignettes sort of come up. One is that he describes how when he goes into the canteen and he sees things, he's automatically poised to get them, to grab them, to take them. It's something acquisitive about the way we look around. Whereas when he goes in and he can't really see, but he can smell things and so on, he doesn't have this acquisitive feeling. He feels more at one with the whole world in which he's part, except that the world, there's an immediacy of the sound when his children are playing around him. There's not like a screen in which he sees them at a distance. He sort of feels their voices in his presence. And he learnt what people who lose their sight do learn, a kind of echolocation, whereby they can detect things in their path simply by the reflection of sound and the way in which that sound is reflected. You must research this, I'm sure. So anyway, I just think it's extraordinary because he describes the difference between a world based on sound, which is accepting, which is unifying, which is very present, and a world of vision, which is somewhat detached and somewhat more, in service of acquisition.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And so two reactions. One is, and also getting back to binding is you talk about how I think we both see ourselves as being being able to predict. The brain can be a predicting organ based on all of the experiences that we have had. But the other is in terms of sound and memory. So we have been communicating with each other using sound. Living creatures have for hundreds of thousands of years. We've only very recently, in the past few thousand years, begun writing. And, we
Absolutely.
can understand why, Socrates was very concerned with, our taking to writing, because there's something about the remembering through sound that is very, very important. That we are losing. History used to be carried down through stories and through sound. We are losing, I think, the capacity of our auditory memory. And yet, one of the things that is so telling is that in people who have severe dementia and no longer recognize their family members, if they hear some music that was a part of their lives, it engages, you remember the music of your life. It has been bound with your cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward systems.
Yes,
and
yes,
through
yes.
the music, you bring the person back, even just temporarily, but that's the last thing to go, because sound and
Yes,
memory
yes,
are
yes,
so deeply,
yes.
deeply bound.
And embodied, yes.
And
I can't remember who it is, but there is a completely wonderful, I mean, God, it's so moving, clip on YouTube somewhere. And if I remember to, I'll try and add it to the tail of this discussion when it goes up. But it's of an American ballerina who has become demented, and she's pretty much immobilized in a wheelchair, and she's totally impassive, and she doesn't recognize or respond. And then somebody has the idea of playing Swan Lake to her, and suddenly her face lightens, and you can see her movements, her body is living this music. It is unbelievable. Yeah. There is a connection there that is made by music, and there is nothing more powerful in making emotional connection and deep spiritual connection than music, which is why all faiths, all spiritual traditions have a special place for music as connecting us with something sacred and special. Yeah.
Do you, what kind of music do you make these days?
I don't make any music these days, much to my chagrin. I have a piano, and I used to play the piano pretty badly. Um, but I've now got such arthritic fingers that I can't really do it.
Give it a
I could have done.
try.
I
Because
probably could have done it.
my mom, who was a
Yes,
pianist, she, towards the end of her life, she had enormously arthritic hands, and somehow, kind of like your ballerina, she would sit down at the piano
yes,
and
yes,
manage to play anyway.
yes. No, when I read that, I thought yes, but I think what had happened was that your mother had probably never stopped, whereas I stopped for a very long time, so that those pathways are not as bright and fresh and crisp as they should be. But anyway, I think it's a very important element, yeah,
And
in life.
music,
Well, I mean,
go ahead, go ahead.
no, carry on, please.
Oh, just
No,
the idea of music is getting back to the idea of science. I
yes,
really do believe that music is. I mean, it's very, just because it is difficult to measure the effect of musical experience on the nervous system, and that there are limitations. There
yeah,
doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done. And,
no, no,
I mean, so, the work that we have done, we have gone into schools where they have, have been able to study kids who have had musical education, kids who have not had musical education. And we've been able to measure their brain's response to the many ingredients of sound that we know are important for language and reading and connecting.
yes,
And
yes.
yet, we had difficulty initially even getting the work published, because, when you're in the field,
Yeah,
this is not a controlled laboratory experiment. Every
no,
child,
no, yes,
like
yes,
they wanted to know what was the dose. How many hours did they play?
yes, yes,
Did you
yes,
control
yes.
for the different music? Did you control for once you subject music to a to something that you can dispense in a
Yes,
laboratory, it's no longer
yes,
music. I mean, there's the whole
yes, yes,
improvisation
yes,
nature of
yes.
music.
That's it.
I mean, it's so complex, but that doesn't mean we can't study it. And we've learned a lot.
No, exactly. And also the impulse to say, well, can we control for this, that, and the other is a good one. It's a healthy one. It's a reasonable one. But you've got to accept that for certain aspects of experience, that this approach will end up measuring something different from what you really want to measure. We measure a proxy that can be measured for something that is not really represented in the measure. And that's, I think, a big problem in this kind of area. By the way, I think you mentioned, possibly in an email to me or in the book, that a friend of yours, when he or she brought the baby home from the hospital, played Tallis for the
Yes.
first week
Yeah.
or two. And I with my first child, I played Bach to her. And I have to say, I think she has not the slightest interest in Bach. Is there anything in that famous thing we all heard about 20 years ago, the Mozart effect, or does that not really exist? The idea that if you play Mozart to a child before it's even able to speak, it will increase its intelligence.
Yeah. I think that clearly in the moment, music has an effect, which is, the Mozart effect was kind of a mood effect, that kids,
Yeah,
people performed better on a test after listening to music because they were just in a better mood. But it wasn't that the listening to music made you smarter. In terms of what I can measure with our biological approach, which I think is a way of assessing who we are and how we respond to sound based on our experience, I can say that people who make music, and singing counts, it doesn't matter what genre it is, that there really are certain aspects of sound processing that are fundamentally changed. They are fundamentally different. People who make music process in sound the neural ingredients of the harmonics, which are important not only for distinguishing two instruments playing the same notes, but we know that they're two different instruments. We distinguish them based on the harmonics, but we also distinguish a D and a B and a G based on harmonics. So harmonics, FM sweeps, timing, these are aspects of sound processing that are strengthened automatically with the Beams hypothesis. The afferent system automatically hears the world in this crisper, more precise, more detailed way, because the efferent system has been worked again and again and again as you resolve the physical complexities of listening and moving your hands and this betweenness, this back and forth that happens when you make music. I have no evidence in terms of listening that it fundamentally changes the brain in this manner. I like to say watching spectator sports is not going to make you physically fit.
Correct.
Right?
Although you can learn skills from watching things.
Well, that's the thing. Is
different matter.
I think that
Yes,
there are
yes.
measures. I'm sure that what you listen to and the environment that you live in. You come home, and it was my piano teacher and piano tuner, Salvatore Spina, who helps me. Because my intersection with music is pretty eclectic in terms of the kinds of music that I play. I use notes and I like to improvise and different kinds, and he really helps me become sort of the Renaissance man that I would like to be when I play music, which I don't play very well at all, but with great joy. But the fact is, with great love, he chose this music, and your child feels the love. They feel the importance. Clearly, there's some learning going on. It may not be the kind of learning that I am talking about in terms when I'm measuring the effect of musical experience year after year from music instruction or learning to play an instrument. But I give the example of, I don't watch spectator sports that much. But if I like watching basketball sometimes, but I don't know very much about it. And all I can really tell is, oh, he's made a basket, or oh, he missed that shot. Whereas anybody who knows about basketball has seen so many things that have been leading up to that shot. And so, clearly our knowledge, as I'm sure with music, we, because my piano teacher's kids do all play instruments. And I think that, again, it's this reciprocity, this knowledge of playing the instrument really informs their listening. Their listening will inform their playing. So did I answer your question at all?
Yes. And, I just want to add that, music can communicate so much that we're not aware of it. Killer whales can orchestrate an attack in 3 dimensions by simply communicating tones to other killer whales, which is remarkable. But also very subtle things, so that, mammals can communicate all kinds of experiences through sounds, and mothers and infants can communicate using pretty much only music. In The Master and His Emissary, I have a whole chapter on the way in which music is foundational to language. And I take issue with Steven Pinker's idea that music is just a worthless exaptation of language about as useful as pornography or cheesecake, I think he says somewhere. But that in fact music is the foundation of our ability to communicate about the world at all and to be with other organisms and to communicate with them. And that language is a rather late exaptation from music. So there we are.
Yes. Have you
Yes.
ever read the something Neanderthal?
The Singing Neanderthal by
Yes,
Stephen Meithen. Yes.
yes.
Yes, I have
And he
indeed.
really
Yes.
makes a nice
Yes.
point.
Yes.
He
Yes.
he explores the thesis you just made that music,
Yes. Yes.
preceded language,
Yes.
and I think
Yes.
does it in a nice way.
Well, in a way, I nabbed that thesis from Stephen Meithen because I read various people's ideas about this, and it seemed to me that his was much better supported by the data that we have and by our knowledge of a lot of things, including wonderful things that one can detect from skeletons, about how the rib cage was used, how large the hypoglossal nerve was. All these things tell us about whether there was speech or not. And so another thing I like very much was, because I learnt in writing these books an enormous amount about how clever birds are. And of course, birds are the other creatures that sing, although they don't sort of harmonize their singing exactly, but they do, and how much they know and long-term memories. I think I remember learning that a crow can remember a single human face after one exposure 2 years later. So that's an extraordinary thing to be able to do at all. I mean, think of facial recognition in itself. But they can solve all sorts of problems and so on. And I think I remember you saying that although apes don't have particularly good long-term memories, humans have much better long-term memories, and that I think you implied that maybe birds do. I don't know whether they do or
Yeah.
not, but you said other singing creatures have long-term memories that are improved, which I thought was rather interesting.
Yeah, and actually, this is something I need to research a little bit more deeply. But I find it
Right.
intriguing that it is the vocal creatures, like birds and people, that have especially long. They have very well developed auditory memory. And
Yeah.
I think that this again
And
speaks
other kinds of
to,
memory, perhaps.
yes, but I think it really
Yes.
speaks to this connection between sound and memory. The sound and
Yes.
memory and
Yes.
sound
Yes.
and using sound to connect us is something that
Yes.
very much relies on on our memory.
Yes. Yes. Well, are there areas that you would like to talk about that we haven't had an opportunity to talk about?
Well, I really I feel that we've covered some ground. I feel like I could. There's so many things that I would love to talk with you about, but I guess maybe the one, you do put great stock in how important it is to combine information from different disciplines, and I think that that really does bring us closer to truth. And on the one hand, that is a very important part of what we do. If anyone goes to the homepage of our website, they will see, or even just the second part of my book, we study aging and concussion and music and bilingualism and language and its disorders, noise. And you might wonder, what are they doing at Brain Volts, which is my lab?
I know.
And it's all under this umbrella of sound in the brain. And you have an umbrella of the hemisphere views of the world. and you draw so beautifully from from philosophy, from physics. It's lovely, but there are. I think we are discouraged in taking this kind of a view. Certainly what I think has strengthened the work that we do at Brain Vaults is that we cross many disciplines, but it also makes funding extremely difficult at times because, whereas institutes, our ideas align very well with institutes of, for example, the National Institutes of Health, the particular study sections are, you have specialists who increasingly see the world in their specialized way. And so I think that there are many forces that conspire against pulling together information from other sources, and also this disrespect for the unknown in a way, in that now when we write, it used to be you would write a grant and you would have a research program. And the whole reason for doing the science is you didn't know what you were going to find.
Exactly.
And, there was some trust in the scientists that they would make the best decisions that they could along the way to try to get to a better understanding of that question. Now, when you write a grant, they want to know what are, what outcomes do you, what deliverables do you have? And that saddens me. And I think that is one of the reasons that I have just taken such great encouragement and solace from your book and from your books and your perspective. And I think I just want to thank you.
Well, thank you too, altrettanto. I feel that in this world there's so much emphasis on specialization, and it is important, but it's only half of the story and the lesser half. I mean, I think, I say our capacity to break things down into parts, analyze them and see the divisions is massively important and stupendous, and it's second only to our capacity to integrate. And that is really where the deliverables, if you like, although not in the economic sense, well, ultimately, of course, in an economic sense it could be, but really the important thing is about knowledge and understanding, and one only understands and sees what it is one's dealing with when one understands the context. Context is everything, and so one needs that broad context, and that's not encouraged these days at all. Sadly, and that diminishes science. So there's probably something in the idea which has been put about by many scientists that science had a golden age, if you like, in the first half of the 20th century, reaching up to the sort of 60s and 70s. And enormous numbers of breakthroughs were made at that period. But that since then, what has more or less happened is that people have followed out the sort of more detailed implications of those changes. But the big shifts have not really occurred anymore.
But yeah, and Ian, I do think that, on the one hand, this pressure to see things in ever tinier parts, the waves, the particles, the imaging studies, if we could just image a little bit better. This is really important. I mean, my work depends on incredibly fine microsecond timing. The better we can be at measuring these systems at a micro level, I think that the better we can perform our science. But I think that this acknowledgement, and why I loved your work on when you really brought in a lot of the questions in physics, and how the physicists will, for the most part, really agree with your view that there is a certain point upon which you do need to interpret the data. Moreover, you need to do something else that science often abhors, which is, I believe that science is a deeply personal endeavor. And it and you
Absolutely.
know that is often not a respect. This is why in my book I write these personal vignettes
I love
because
that.
because it's done by humans. Science is done by
Yes,
humans,
yes,
and we
yes,
can't
yes.
we can't forget that, and that's why we have.
No,
It's one of the reasons that we make mistakes. We go off
yes.
in this direction or another, but it's also something to be
I know,
really loved and honored.
I know, I know. Well, as I sometimes reflect, Darwin, Einstein, Freud, these were all thinkers largely on their own. And when Rutherford discovered the structure of the atom, there was only one author on the paper, himself. But when people found that they'd managed to get some evidence for the existence of the Higgs boson, there were more than 1,000 authors on the paper, and that illustrates there are certain things that can only be done with massive amounts of money and colossal outlay and a hierarchy of people, an empire in a department somewhere in universities. But there are also lots of things that most of the great insights in the history of science were made by people often on the kitchen table or in the garden or whatever. Really, this is the history of science to a very large extent. So there we are. Anyway, it's been absolutely lovely talking to you. Thank you very much. And I hope that we'll perhaps meet one day. That would be rather nice.
I would love that.
So thank you very, very much.
Ciao. Thank you.
Bye bye.